The moment I stepped into my commanding officer's office and saw the old man from the diner sitting there in a perfectly pressed uniform with 4 stars on his shoulders, my first thought was that I had somehow walked into the wrong room. 4 stars. In the Marine Corps, that kind of rank doesn't just appear by accident. My commanding officer stood beside his desk, unusually quiet, watching me with the kind of expression that makes your stomach tighten before anyone even says a word. The old man looked at me calmly, the same quiet eyes I remembered from 2 weeks earlier. And that's when he said my name. Corporal Harris. Hearing my name in the voice of a 4-star general is not something you ever forget. But to understand how I got there, standing stiff in a headquarters office in Norfolk, wondering if my career was about to end, you have to go back to a rainy Tuesday evening 2 weeks earlier. It had been a long day on base. The kind of long that seems to stretch forever, where every task takes twice as long as it should, and every Marine looks like they're running on fumes. I was stationed at the Marine Corps base outside Norfolk, Virginia, and that particular day had been nothing but logistics work, inventory checks, equipment inspections, paperwork stacked higher than it should ever be. By the time I finally signed out for the day, the sky had already turned the dull gray color that meant rain was coming. Sure enough, by the time I pulled onto the road outside the base gate, the rain had started. Nothing dramatic, just a steady coastal drizzle that made the asphalt shine under the headlights. I wasn't ready to go home yet. Some nights you just need a quiet place to sit for a few minutes before you drive the rest of the way. There's a small diner about 10 minutes from the base that a lot of service members stop at. Nothing fancy. A place that's been there since before I joined the Corps. The sign out front flickers a little. The coffee is strong enough to wake the dead. And the booths have that cracked red vinyl that sticks to your uniform if you sit too long. But the place feels familiar, comfortable. I pulled into the parking lot and parked beside a couple pickup trucks and an old sedan that had probably seen better decades. Inside, the diner smelled like bacon grease and fresh coffee. There were maybe 6 people scattered around the room, an older couple sharing pie, a truck driver reading a newspaper, and 2 sailors sitting at the counter arguing about football. I slid into a booth near the window and ordered a coffee. The waitress Linda had worked there for years and recognized half the Marines who came through. "Long day?" she asked as she poured. "Aren't they all?" I said. She smiled the way people do when they've heard that answer 1,000 times. While I sat there warming my hands around the mug, I noticed an older man standing at the register near the counter. He was wearing a faded Vietnam veteran cap, the kind you see a lot around Norfolk. The brim was worn soft from years of use. He had the posture of someone who had spent a lifetime standing straight, even though his shoulders had started to bend with age. Linda was speaking to him quietly. At first I didn't pay much attention, but then I heard her say something that made me look up. "Sir, I'm sorry, it looks like the card didn't go through." The man paused. Not angry. Not embarrassed exactly. Just still. Like someone trying to process a small inconvenience that had suddenly become public. He reached into his jacket and pulled the card out again, studying it like maybe the numbers had changed since the last time he looked. Linda tried the machine again. The little receipt printer buzzed. She shook her head. "I'm sorry, sir." The room had gotten just quiet enough for people to notice. Nobody said anything. But you could feel the attention shift. The old man let out a slow breath. "Well," he said calmly, "I suppose these things happen." He reached for his wallet again. I could see it from where I sat. Empty except for a few folded bills that clearly weren't enough. That moment, just that small pause, was enough. I stood up, walked over to the counter, and pulled out my own card. "Put it on mine," I told Linda. The old man turned toward me. "You don't have to do that," he said. "It's fine," I said. Linda rang it through before the conversation could turn into an argument. The old man studied me for a second. Up close, I could see the lines in his face, the kind carved by decades of weather and experience. "You a Marine?" he asked. "Yes, sir." He nodded slowly. "Well, thank you." His voice carried the quiet weight of someone who had spent most of his life choosing his words carefully. I didn't make a big deal out of it. "Just returning the favor," I said. He tilted his head slightly. "Favor? Veterans look out for each other," I said. He considered that. Then he smiled. Not wide. Just enough to show he understood. "Well," he said, "I appreciate it." I paid the bill and picked up my coffee to go. I was halfway to the door when he spoke again. "Marine." I turned. Yes, sir. He looked at me for a moment like he was memorizing my face. Then he asked the one thing that would come back to haunt me 2 weeks later. What's your name? Corporal Emily Harris, I said. He nodded once. Good to meet you, Corporal Harris. Then I walked out into the rain. At the time, it felt like nothing more than a small moment. Just one veteran helping another. I drove home that night thinking about equipment reports and morning inspections, not about the quiet old man in the diner. And certainly not about how 2 weeks later I would walk into headquarters and see that same man sitting behind my commanding officer's desk, wearing the uniform of a 4-star general. At that moment, standing in that office, one thought ran through my mind. What in the world had I gotten myself into? Standing in front of a 4-star general who knew my name was the last place I expected to be that morning. But the truth is, by the time I walked into headquarters that day, I was already bracing for something bad. Just not that kind of bad. 2 weeks earlier, after the diner incident, life had returned to what passes for normal on a Marine Corps base. Which is to say busy, loud, and occasionally miserable. The rain had cleared the next morning, and Norfolk woke up to one of those cold coastal days where the wind cuts through your uniform like it has a personal grudge. I arrived on base before sunrise, coffee in hand, joining the steady line of Marines heading through the gates. Morning formations are predictable. Boots on pavement. Engines idling. Orders getting passed down. You fall into rhythm without thinking about it. That morning started like any other. But it didn't stay that way. Because that was the same week Major Daniel Whitaker took over operations in our unit. Every base has a reputation officer. The one people talk about in low voices in the chow hall. The one Marines warn each other about when someone new shows up. Whitaker already had that reputation. He had transferred in from another command, and within days the stories started circulating. Career climber. Loves paperwork more than people. Careful around him. At first I didn't pay much attention. Every command has rumors. You learn quickly not to believe all of them. But within a few days it became clear the rumors weren't exaggerations. Major Whitaker ran things with the kind of rigid authority that left no room for common sense. Every small mistake became a lecture. Every minor delay became a written warning. One afternoon during a maintenance inspection, a lance corporal in my unit misread a checklist. Nothing dangerous. Nothing even unusual. Whitaker stopped the entire inspection and spent 10 minutes tearing into the kid in front of 20 Marines. You represent the United States Marine Corps, he snapped. Attention to detail is not optional. The lance corporal looked like he wanted to sink through the concrete floor. Afterward in the motor pool, one of the older sergeants muttered under his breath. Guy doesn't lead Marines, he said. He manages paperwork. Nobody laughed. Because everyone knew exactly what he meant. At first, Whitaker didn't notice me much. I kept my head down, did my work, and tried to stay out of the blast radius. But that changed about a week after he arrived. It started with a supply report. Nothing dramatic. Just a routine inventory check on equipment assigned to our section. I had completed the paperwork and submitted it through the chain of command. 2 days later, I was called into Whitaker's office. If you've ever been summoned into an officer's office unexpectedly, you know the feeling. Your brain runs through every possible mistake you might have made. I knocked on the door. Enter. Whitaker sat behind his desk, perfectly composed. He held a copy of my report. Corporal Harris, he said without looking up. Do you believe accuracy matters in this organization? Yes, sir. He slid the report across the desk. There are discrepancies here. I looked at the page. A small numbering error on one of the equipment lines. The kind of clerical mistake that gets corrected in about 30 seconds. I can correct that immediately, sir. Whitaker leaned back in his chair. That's not the point. And that was the moment I realized this wasn't about paperwork. It was about control. He spent the next 15 minutes explaining how even minor errors reflected poorly on unit discipline. His tone stayed calm the entire time, which somehow made it worse. Finally, he said the words that made my stomach drop. I'll be placing a note in your record. For a small inventory typo. I walked out of the office with the feeling that I had just stepped onto someone's radar. Over the next few days, things got worse. Extra inspections. Additional reports. Assignments that suddenly seemed to land on my desk more often than anyone else's. Nothing dramatic enough to complain about, but enough to wear a person down. One afternoon in the motor pool, Sergeant Delgado pulled me aside. "You okay, Harris?" "Fine, Sergeant." He studied me for a second. "You're on Whitaker's list." "What list?" "The list of Marines he thinks need extra supervision." I sighed. "Great." Delgado shook his head. "Don't take it personally. Guy's been doing this everywhere he goes." "Why does command allow it?" He gave a dry laugh. "Because on paper he looks perfect." That's the problem with certain types of officers. They know exactly how far they can push things without crossing a line that gets them in trouble. Whitaker never yelled. Never threatened. He just documented everything. And paperwork can ruin a career faster than shouting ever could. By the end of the second week, the tension around the unit had grown thick enough to feel. Marines whispered about transfer requests. One corporal in another section had already been written up twice for things that used to be handled with a conversation. Then came the morning everything changed. It was a Thursday. Cold and clear. I had just finished morning checks when Sergeant Delgado walked toward me with a look I didn't like. "Harris," he said quietly. "Yes, Sergeant." "Headquarters just called." My stomach tightened. "What about—" "You're ordered to report." That phrase always carries weight. Ordered to report. It means someone higher up wants to see you. Immediately. Did they say why? Number. That was the worst possible answer. As I walked toward the administrative building, my mind ran through every report, every inspection, every conversation I'd had with Major Whitaker. Had he escalated something? Filed a formal complaint. Career-ending paperwork often starts with a quiet meeting behind closed doors. The headquarters building stood near the center of the base. Clean brick walls. American flag snapping in the wind. Inside, everything smelled faintly of floor polish and old paper. The receptionist looked up when I entered. "Corporal Harris." "Yes, ma'am." "Go right in." I walked down the hallway, boots echoing against the tile floor. When I reached the door, I paused for half a second. Then I knocked. "Enter." I stepped inside. My commanding officer stood beside his desk. And sitting calmly in the chair across from him was the old man from the diner. Except this time he was wearing a perfectly pressed Marine Corps dress uniform. 4 stars on his shoulders, and suddenly the story of a quiet dinner 2 weeks earlier didn't seem quite so simple anymore. When you're a corporal in the Marine Corps, you learn early that walking into headquarters usually means one of 2 things. Either someone important wants to congratulate you, or someone important wants to ruin your day. Standing in that doorway staring at the old man from the diner now wearing 4 stars on his shoulders, I had absolutely no idea which one it was going to be. My commanding officer cleared his throat. "Corporal Harris, step in and close the door." I stepped forward, trying very hard not to stare. Up close, the details were impossible to miss. The uniform was immaculate. 4 silver stars rested neatly on each shoulder board. Rows of ribbons covered the left side of his chest. Even before anyone said his name, there was no doubt in my mind. This man wasn't just a general. He was one of the most senior officers in the entire Marine Corps. The kind whose decisions shaped the lives of thousands of Marines. And 2 weeks earlier, I had bought him a plate of eggs and coffee at a roadside diner. I snapped to attention. "Corporal Emily Harris reporting as ordered, sir." The general studied me for a moment. Then he smiled slightly. It was the same calm expression I remembered from the diner. "At ease, Corporal," he said. His voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades giving orders. I relaxed slightly, though my heart was still beating harder than usual. My commanding officer gestured toward the chair across from the general. "Have a seat, Harris." That alone was unusual. Junior enlisted Marines don't usually sit during meetings with generals. I sat carefully, trying to keep my posture straight. The general leaned back slightly in his chair. "Corporal Harris," he said, "do you recognize me?" There didn't seem to be any point pretending otherwise. "Yes, sir." He raised an eyebrow. "From where?" "The diner outside Norfolk, sir." A hint of amusement crossed his face. "That's correct." My commanding officer folded his arms. "General Robert Whitman," he said, as if I somehow didn't already know. The name hit me immediately. Whitman was a legend in the Corps. 35 years of service. Multiple deployments. The kind of officer whose speeches get quoted in leadership classes. And 2 weeks ago I had watched him struggle with a declined credit card at a diner counter. My brain was still trying to process the situation when he spoke again. You left rather quickly that night. Yes, sir. Why? The question caught me off guard. I shrugged slightly. It didn't seem like a big deal, sir. The general tilted his head. Buying a stranger dinner isn't a big deal. No, sir. He looked genuinely curious now. Why not? I took a breath. Because he was a veteran, sir. The general's eyes stayed on mine. And that was enough. Yes, sir. My commanding officer shifted slightly beside his desk, watching the conversation unfold. The general nodded slowly. That's interesting. He reached down and picked up a small folder from the desk. I travel to different bases several times a year, he said calmly. Sometimes officially, sometimes quietly. He tapped the folder lightly. I prefer to see how things operate when people don't know who I am. The realization began to settle in. The diner hadn't been an accident. It had been observation. You were evaluating the base, sir, I asked carefully. In a manner of speaking? He opened the folder. Inside were several printed documents. Personnel reports. Unit evaluations. And something else. My name. I felt my stomach tighten. Corporal Harris, he said, are you familiar with Major Daniel Whitaker? Yes, sir. My commanding officer let out a slow breath. The general watched my reaction closely. How would you describe your interactions with him? That question carried weight. In the Marine Corps, you don't casually criticize officers, especially not in front of a 4-star general. But Whitman's expression wasn't hostile. It was patient. Like someone genuinely waiting for an honest answer. I chose my words carefully. Professional, sir. The general smiled slightly. That's a very diplomatic response. My commanding officer finally spoke. Harris, this is an internal matter. Speak freely. I hesitated for a moment. Then I answered honestly. Sir, Major Whitaker has been extremely strict with administrative discipline. Whitman nodded. Yes, I've read the reports. He slid one of the papers across the desk. It was the disciplinary note Whitaker had placed in my file. For the inventory typo. The general looked at it for a long moment. Then he asked a simple question. Do you believe this report accurately reflects your performance? I swallowed. No, sir. Whitman leaned back again. That's what I suspected. Silence settled over the room. Outside the office window, I could see Marines walking across the base courtyard. Normal life continuing like nothing unusual was happening. Inside the room, the atmosphere felt very different. Finally, the general closed the folder. Corporal Harris, he said calmly, you're here today for 2 reasons. I waited. First, he said I wanted to thank you for your kindness at the diner. I blinked. Sir, you helped someone who appeared to be an elderly veteran having a difficult moment. Yes, sir. And you did so quietly without seeking recognition. That seemed like the right thing to do, sir. Whitman nodded again. That tells me a great deal about your character. Then his tone shifted slightly. But that's not the only reason you're here. My heart rate ticked up again. The general turned toward my commanding officer. Has Major Whitaker arrived? Any minute now, my CO replied. Whitman folded his hands on the desk. Good. I felt a sudden chill. Because the expression on the general's face had changed. It was still calm. Still controlled. But now there was something else behind it. Resolve. And suddenly I had the strong feeling that this meeting had very little to do with a diner bill. A knock sounded on the door. My commanding officer called out, Enter. The door opened. Major Daniel Whitaker stepped inside. He stopped the moment he saw the general. His confident posture stiffened instantly. Sir, I wasn't aware. General Whitman didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at him. Major Whitaker, he said quietly. Please have a seat. And that's when I realized something important. This meeting had been planned very carefully, and someone in this room was about to have a very bad day. Major Whitaker didn't sit down right away. For a moment he just stood there in the doorway, clearly trying to figure out how he had walked into a room with a 4-star general, his commanding officer, and one of his corporals sitting at the same table. The confidence he normally carried around the base had vanished almost instantly. Sir Whitaker said, snapping to attention, I wasn't aware you were visiting today. General Whitman didn't respond immediately. He simply watched the major for a few seconds, the way a senior Marine sometimes studies a situation before speaking. Major, he said calmly, please close the door. Whitaker did. Then he sat down. I could see his eyes flick briefly toward me, confusion written all over his face. Why was I here? Why was he here? And why did the general seem to be running the conversation? Whitman folded his hands on the desk. Major Whitaker, he said, how long have you been assigned to this base? 3 weeks, sir. And prior to that? Camp Pendleton, sir. Whitman nodded slowly. I see. He opened the folder again. I recognized the papers inside. Personnel reports. Inspection notes. The same kind of administrative paperwork that had been showing up around our unit since Whitaker arrived. The general looked down at one page, then another. Major, he said, are you familiar with the concept of leadership through authority versus leadership through trust? Whitaker straightened slightly. Yes, sir. And which approach do you believe is most effective? Both have their place, sir. Whitman gave a small nod. That's an acceptable answer. Then he slid one of the documents across the desk. Whitaker picked it up. I recognized the report immediately. The disciplinary note Whitaker had placed in my file over the supply report typo. Whitman watched him read it. Do you recall filing this? Yes, sir. Explain the situation. Whitaker's voice was steady. There was a documentation discrepancy in a logistics report, sir. I believed corrective action was necessary. The general leaned back slightly. Corrective action? Yes, sir. Whitman tapped the table lightly with his finger. Did you speak with Corporal Harris before filing the report? Whitaker hesitated. No, sir. Did you confirm whether the discrepancy affected operational readiness? No, sir. Whitman nodded again. Interesting. The room felt very quiet. My commanding officer hadn't spoken since Whitaker entered, but I could tell he was watching every detail carefully. Whitman turned another page in the folder. Major Whitaker. He continued, during my visit to this base, I made a point of speaking with several Marines across different units. Whitaker remained silent. Do you know why I sometimes visit bases without announcing my rank? No, sir. So I can observe how Marines behave when they believe no one important is watching. Whitaker nodded once. That makes sense, sir. Whitman's eyes shifted briefly toward me. And occasionally he said I learned something unexpected. The room went still again. Whitman closed the folder slowly. 2 weeks ago he said I visited a diner outside Norfolk. Whitaker frowned slightly. A diner, sir? Yes. Whitman rested his hands calmly on the desk. At that diner my credit card was declined. Whitaker blinked, clearly unsure where this conversation was heading. I see, sir. And when that happened, Whitman continued, Corporal Harris quietly paid the bill. Whitaker glanced toward me again. For the first time since entering the room, his expression showed real confusion. Whitman continued, speaking in the same calm tone. She did not ask for recognition. He looked directly at Whitaker. She did not even stay long enough to receive thanks. Whitaker nodded awkwardly. That was generous of her, sir? Yes, Whitman said. It was. Another pause followed. Then Whitman leaned forward slightly. But that isn't the reason this meeting was scheduled. Whitaker's posture tightened. Whitman opened the folder again. Inside were several additional documents. He slid them across the desk toward Whitaker. During my visit, the general said I also reviewed personnel reports from this command. Whitaker picked up the pages. As he read them, his expression changed. Slowly. Subtly. The confidence he normally carried began to drain away. Whitman continued speaking. Major Whitaker. I have here a series of administrative actions you've taken against junior Marines during your first 3 weeks on this base. Whitaker cleared his throat. Yes, sir. Whitman tapped the folder. 6 disciplinary reports. Yes, sir. 4 additional written warnings. Whitaker shifted in his chair. Corrective leadership, sir. Whitman's voice remained perfectly calm. Is that what you call it? Whitaker nodded cautiously. Yes, sir. Whitman leaned back again. And yet, he said quietly, in speaking with the Marines in your unit, I noticed a pattern. Whitaker didn't respond. Morale is dropping. The room stayed silent. Marines described feeling targeted rather than guided. Whitaker tried to maintain composure. With respect, sir, discipline sometimes feels uncomfortable. Whitman nodded slowly. That's true. Then he said something that made the air in the room feel colder. But discipline must be fair. He tapped one of the pages again. In several of these reports, the alleged mistakes were administrative errors that could have been corrected with a conversation. Whitaker said nothing. Whitman continued. Instead, you documented them formally. Yes, sir. Why? Whitaker hesitated. Accountability, sir. Whitman studied him carefully. Then he asked the question that changed everything. Major Whitaker, did you ever consider that leadership might involve protecting the Marines under your command rather than documenting their mistakes? Whitaker opened his mouth. Closed it. The general folded his hands again. I've spent 35 years in the Marine Corps, Whitman said calmly. I've commanded units in combat zones and training bases alike. He paused for a moment. And in that time I've learned something important. The room was silent enough that I could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning vent. Whitman's voice remained steady. You can measure leadership in many ways. He looked directly at Whitaker. But one of the clearest indicators is how your Marines feel when you walk into the room. Whitaker's face had grown noticeably pale. Whitman closed the folder. Major Whitaker, he said we're going to discuss your leadership style in detail. He nodded toward my commanding officer. And we're going to do it right now. Whitaker swallowed. Because at that moment it became clear to everyone in the room. This meeting was not an evaluation. It was an investigation. And the quiet kindness shown in a diner 2 weeks earlier had simply opened the door for the truth to come out. Major Whitaker had always carried himself with the calm confidence of a man who believed the system worked in his favor. But sitting across from General Whitman that morning, that confidence was fading fast. The room felt smaller somehow. The walls hadn't moved, of course, but the weight of the conversation made everything tighter, quieter. Whitman closed the folder in front of him and rested both hands on the desk. Major Whitaker, he said evenly, leadership in the Marine Corps requires judgment. Whitaker nodded stiffly. Yes, sir. And judgment, Whitman continued, requires understanding the difference between discipline and intimidation. Whitaker shifted slightly in his chair. With respect, sir, my intention has always been to maintain standards. Whitman studied him for a long moment. Standards are important, the general said. No Marine would argue otherwise. He leaned back slightly. But leadership is not a paperwork contest. Whitaker's jaw tightened. Across the room, my commanding officer remained silent, though I could see from his expression that none of this surprised him. Whitman opened the folder again. Inside were several additional documents I hadn't seen before. During my visit, he said calmly, I requested feedback from Marines in this unit. Whitaker looked confused. Feedback, sir? Yes. Whitman slid several papers across the desk. Anonymous statements. Whitaker picked them up slowly. I could see the tension in his shoulders as he began reading. The statements weren't long. Just a few paragraphs each. But the message was clear. Marines describing unnecessary disciplinary reports. Minor mistakes escalated into formal warnings. A leadership style focused more on documentation than mentorship. Whitman let the silence stretch while Whitaker read. After a minute, the major set the papers down. Sir, he said carefully, Marines sometimes misunderstand strict leadership. Whitman nodded slightly. That's possible. Then he tapped another page in the folder. This is the 4th report you filed this month against junior Marines for clerical errors. Whitaker didn't respond. Whitman continued. Do you believe Marines develop confidence when every small mistake becomes official paperwork? Whitaker hesitated. Sir, discipline must be maintained. Whitman's voice stayed calm. Yes. Then he leaned forward slightly. But discipline is not the same thing as fear. The words settled into the room like weight. Whitman turned his attention briefly toward me. Corporal Harris. Yes, sir. Before this report was filed, had you received any counseling regarding the supply discrepancy? No, sir. Whitman nodded. Then he looked back at Whitaker. In 35 years of service, the general said quietly, I've learned something about leadership. Whitaker waited. The strongest units are not the ones where Marines fear their officers. He paused. They are the ones where Marines trust them. Whitaker's composure was slipping now. With respect, sir, I believe my leadership has been appropriate. Whitman studied him carefully. Appropriate. Yes, sir. Whitman closed the folder again. Major Whitaker, he said, I've also reviewed your evaluations from previous commands. Whitaker blinked. My evaluations, sir. Yes. Whitman slid another document forward. This is from your last assignment at Camp Pendleton. Whitaker picked it up. The color drained slightly from his face as he read. Whitman spoke quietly. Your previous commanding officer noted concerns about your tendency to rely heavily on administrative discipline. Whitaker looked up. That was addressed, sir. Whitman nodded. Yes, it was. He folded his hands again. But it appears the pattern continued. The room went silent. Whitaker tried one last time. Sir, I've always acted in the best interest of the Corps. Whitman held his gaze. I'm sure you believe that. Then the general said something that seemed to drain the last bit of confidence from the major. However, leadership is measured by results. Whitman gestured slightly toward my commanding officer. Colonel Reeves. My CO stepped forward. Yes, sir. Whitman's voice remained steady. Based on the report statements and documentation reviewed during this visit, I am recommending that Major Whitaker be relieved of his current operational authority pending a formal command review. Whitaker's head snapped up. Sir. Whitman raised one hand. The room went quiet instantly. This is not a punishment, Major. Whitaker said nothing. It is a pause. Whitman continued. A review will determine whether your leadership approach aligns with the standards expected of officers in this command. Whitaker's shoulders slumped slightly. Yes, sir. Whitman nodded once. You may return to your quarters for now. Whitaker stood slowly. He looked around the room once briefly meeting my eyes. There was no anger in his expression anymore. Just the stunned realization that the system he trusted so much had turned its attention toward him. He straightened his uniform. Permission to leave, sir. Granted. Whitaker walked out of the office. The door closed quietly behind him. For a moment no one spoke. Then Whitman let out a slow breath. Colonel Reeves, he said. Yes, sir. Ensure the review proceeds fairly. Of course, sir. Whitman nodded. Good. The room felt lighter somehow. The tension that had filled it only minutes earlier had eased. Then the general turned his attention back toward me. Corporal Harris. Yes, sir. He smiled slightly. You've had an unusual morning. Yes, sir. That tends to happen sometimes. I allowed myself a small smile. Whitman leaned back in his chair. You know, he said thoughtfully, the Marine Corps runs on discipline. Yes, sir. But it survives on something else. I waited. Character. The word hung in the air. Whitman nodded toward the door Whitaker had exited. Justice in the Corps is rarely loud. He paused. But it must always be fair. And sitting there in that office, I realized something important. The small moment in that diner hadn't changed the course of my career. But it had revealed something much bigger. Leadership, real leadership, was watching everything. Even when you didn't realize it. After Major Whitaker left the office, the room grew quiet in a way that felt different from before. Not tense. Not heavy. Just thoughtful. Colonel Reeves closed the folder on the desk and looked toward General Whitman. Sir, he said respectfully, I'll begin the command review immediately. Whitman nodded. Thank you, Colonel. Reeves gave me a brief glance that was difficult to read, part reassurance, part approval. Then he stepped out of the office to make the necessary calls. The door closed softly behind him. Now it was just the general and me. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. Whitman leaned back slightly in the chair and looked out the window toward the parade ground where Marines were moving between buildings in small groups. From this distance they looked almost like clockwork. Ordered. Precise. But anyone who has served knows that behind that precision are thousands of individual stories. Young Marines learning how to carry responsibility. Leaders learning sometimes the hard way how much influence they truly have over the people under them. Whitman finally turned his attention back to me. Corporal Harris. Yes, sir. He gestured toward the chair again. At ease. I relaxed a little. You're probably wondering why I asked you to stay, he said. Yes, sir. He smiled faintly. Fair enough. Whitman reached for the coffee cup sitting on the desk. It had probably been placed there before I arrived, but he hadn't touched it during the meeting. Now he took a slow sip. You know, he said, when you serve long enough in the Marine Corps, you start to notice patterns. I nodded. Yes, sir. You see young Marines arrive full of energy and purpose. Another sip of coffee. And you see, officers learn how to carry authority. He set the cup down. Some learn the right lessons. He paused. And some don't. I knew he was referring to Whitaker, but he never said the name again. Whitman folded his hands together. Leadership isn't about control, he continued quietly. It's about responsibility. Yes, sir. You'd be surprised how many officers confuse those two things. I believed him. Whitman leaned forward slightly. Do you know why I travel the way I do sometimes? You mentioned observing units quietly, sir. Yes. He nodded. When Marines know a general is visiting, everything changes. Yes, sir. The floors are polished twice. The reports are perfect. Everyone says the right things. He allowed himself a small smile. But that doesn't tell you much about how a unit actually functions. That made sense. So sometimes he said I travel without the ceremony. And the diner was part of that, sir. Whitman chuckled softly. Not intentionally. He tapped the desk lightly. My car had just come from the airfield and I wanted coffee before checking in at the base. So the credit card issue wasn't a test. Number. He shook his head. That part was quite real. For the first time since the meeting began, I felt comfortable enough to smile. Yes, sir? Whitman's expression softened. But your reaction told me something. Sir, you didn't hesitate. I shrugged slightly. It seemed like the right thing to do. That's exactly the point. Whitman leaned back again. Character reveals itself in small moments. He looked toward the window again for a second. When people believe nobody important is watching. The room was quiet except for the distant sounds of activity outside. Then he said something that stayed with me long after that day. In the Marine Corps, rank tells people what authority you have. He paused. But character tells them whether you deserve it. I thought about that. Yes, sir. Whitman looked at me again. You didn't pay that diner bill hoping someone important would notice. No, sir. You didn't even stay long enough for thanks. No, sir? He nodded slowly. That's why it mattered. For a moment we both sat quietly. Then he reached into the folder again. When he pulled out the document this time, it wasn't disciplinary paperwork. It was a single sheet with an official letterhead. He slid it across the desk. Take a look. I picked it up carefully. It was a commendation. A formal note recognizing professionalism and integrity. My name sat neatly typed across the top. Sir. Whitman raised a hand gently. This isn't a reward for buying someone breakfast. I nodded. I understand, sir. It's recognition for something more important. He leaned forward slightly. The Marine Corps needs leaders who understand respect. Yes, sir. Not just upward respect for rank. He tapped the desk lightly. But respect for the Marines who stand beside you. I folded the paper and placed it back on the desk. Thank you, sir. Whitman nodded. You're welcome, Corporal. Then he said something that surprised me. Do you plan to stay in the Corps long term? I thought about it. Yes, sir, I do. He smiled slightly. Good. He stood up from the chair. The movement was slow but steady, the posture of someone who had spent decades in uniform. When you move up in this organization, he said, remember today. Yes, sir. Remember what leadership feels like to the people underneath it. I stood as well. Yes, sir. Whitman extended his hand. For a second I hesitated. It isn't every day a 4-star general offers to shake a corporal's hand. But he waited patiently. So I shook it. His grip was firm. Keep doing the small things right, he said. Yes, sir. Because in the end, he added, those are the things that build the kind of Marine Corps we're proud to serve in. He released my hand. You're dismissed, Corporal Harris. Aye, aye, sir. I stepped out of the office and into the hallway. The base looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier. Marines walking between buildings. Vehicles moving across the motor pool. Routine continuing like nothing unusual had happened. But something had changed for me. Because that morning I had seen what real leadership looked like. And it didn't come from paperwork. It came from character. A few weeks later I found myself driving down the same road outside Norfolk again. It was late afternoon this time, not evening, and the sky was clear instead of rainy. The kind of coastal Virginia day where the air smells faintly of salt, and the wind coming off the bay feels just cool enough to wake you up. The Marine Corps base behind me hummed along like it always did, training schedules, inspections, supply trucks rolling in and out. But things had changed quietly since that morning in headquarters. Major Whitaker never returned to our unit. The command review moved quickly, though most of the details stayed behind closed doors where they belonged. That's how the Corps handles things most of the time, quietly, professionally, without turning leadership mistakes into public spectacle. All anyone really needed to know was that a new operations officer had taken over. And the atmosphere around the unit had shifted almost overnight. Marines were still working hard, standards were still high. But the tension that had hung over the motor pool for weeks had disappeared. Sometimes leadership doesn't need grand speeches. Sometimes it just needs fairness. That afternoon I wasn't thinking about any of that, though. I was thinking about coffee. And about a small diner with cracked red booths and a flickering sign out front. So I turned into the same parking lot where I had stopped 2 weeks before everything changed. The place looked exactly the same. A couple of pickup trucks out front. A delivery van parked crookedly near the side entrance. And through the window I could see Linda moving between tables with a coffee pot in her hand. When I stepped inside, the familiar smell hit me right away. Coffee. Bacon grease. Old vinyl seats warmed by years of use. Linda looked up from behind the counter and broke into a smile. "Well, I'll be," she said. "Corporal Harris." "Yes, ma'am. Haven't seen you in a while." "Been busy." She poured a cup of coffee without even asking. "Usual booth." "Yes, ma'am." I slid into the same booth by the window where I had sat that rainy evening. For a few minutes everything felt wonderfully ordinary. Coffee steaming in front of me. The quiet clink of silverware from the kitchen. 2 older men at the counter discussing fishing conditions like they had probably done every week for the past 20 years. Linda came by to refill my cup. "You look like you had one of those Marine Corps weeks," she said. I laughed softly. "You could say that." She leaned against the booth. "You know, she said something interesting happened after you left here the other night?" "Oh. That old veteran you helped?" "Yes, ma'am." "Well, he came back the next morning." I raised an eyebrow. "He did. Sat right there at the counter and ordered the exact same breakfast." She pointed toward the stool near the register. "What happened?" Linda smiled. "Well, first he asked about you." "About me?" "Mm-hmm." She wiped her hands on a towel. "Wanted to know your name again, asked how often Marines stop in here." I nodded. "That sounds about right." Linda continued. "And before he left, he paid for every Marine's breakfast that walked through the door that morning." I blinked. "He did." "Sure did." She chuckled. "Never told anyone why." That sounded exactly like something General Whitman would do. Quiet. Simple. Respectful. Linda tilted her head slightly. "You know who he was, don't you?" "Yes, ma'am." "Well," she said with a grin, "I figured it out later when the news mentioned a general visiting the base." She shook her head slowly. 4 stars. "Yes, ma'am." Linda laughed softly. "And here I thought he was just another old Marine passing through. In a way, I said he was." She patted the table. "Well, whatever you did that night must have meant something." I looked down at the coffee in my hands. "I think it did." Linda headed back toward the counter, leaving me alone with my thoughts. Outside the window, cars rolled past on the highway. Life moving along the same way it always had. I sat there for a while thinking about the strange chain of events that had started in this little diner. A declined credit card. A quiet act of kindness. A meeting in a headquarters office that had changed the course of someone's career. And a lesson about leadership I would carry for the rest of my life. The Marine Corps teaches you a lot of things. How to work hard. How to endure discomfort. How to rely on the people beside you. But sometimes the most important lessons come from simple moments. A conversation. A decision. A choice to do the right thing even when nobody important seems to be watching. Because the truth is, you never really know who might be. That's something General Whitman understood very well. And something I would remember long after my time in uniform was finished. So, if you're listening to this story and something about it reminds you of a moment in your own life, a time when you had the chance to help someone quietly without recognition, I hope you hold on to that memory. Those moments matter more than we often realize. If this story meant something to you, feel free to share it with someone who believes in the same values, respect fairness, and doing the right thing when it counts. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this one, you're always welcome to come back and listen again. Because sometimes the smallest acts of character can echo farther than we ever expect. Thank you for listening.